studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising and I'm Sonali. It's Thursday, January 29th, 2015. In the wake of King Abdullah's death in Saudi Arabia, we'll examine the Gulf oil states' human rights record and the hypocrisy of Western countries. And President Obama's pick for Attorney General Loretta Lynch faces Senate confirmation hearings. We'll find out what her record is and what sort of AG she could be. Plus, another small town wins a victory against fracking, Carson, California. We'll speak with an activist about the campaign and why it succeeded. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Rahul Mahajan, sitting in for Chenjerai Kumanika. Rahul is a sociologist and news analyst and author of Full Spectrum Dominance. Hi, Rahul.
Hi, Sonali.
Cuba's leader, Raul Castro, issued a stern warning to the U.S. this week, saying he would not tolerate interference in Cuban affairs, even as the U.S. and Cuba attempt to work out a relationship after decades of hostility. Castro spoke at a summit in Costa Rica just days after U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Roberta Jacobson visited the island nation. Jacobson became the highest-ranking U.S. official to visit Cuba in nearly 40 years. While Cuba's leadership wants an end to the U.S.-led crippling embargo, there's also contention over the ownership of Guantanamo. The U.S. has run a prison on its naval base in Guantanamo, Cuba, that since the September 11th attacks has held hundreds of detainees for years, taking advantage of their lack of human rights on non-U.S. soil. President Obama needs cooperation from the Republican-dominated Congress to address these issues and has already faced serious resistance from Senators Marco Rubio and others. Rahul, do you think the U.S. could really reconcile with Cuba while actually respecting its sovereignty?
Well, it's certainly theoretically possible. I don't think that it's likely at all. In fact, when Obama announced attempts to start normalizing relations with Cuba, I've been waiting ever since for someone to mention Guantanamo Bay, and sadly it figures that it had to be Raul Castro who mentioned it and not really mainstream political figures in the United States. I mean, this is a humiliating colonial imposition. It's done in a grossly illegal fashion. In fact, the strongest U.S. legal case for maintaining Guantanamo is that once 55 years ago, the fledgling Cuban government cashed a single rent check. It's been complaining ever since. I think you know what would happen if you paid rent once 55 years ago and your landlord had been trying to get you out ever since. So I think it's pretty clear, and it's very unlikely it's going to happen.
And then here in the United States, poverty among children remains a major problem, as a new study of census data found that a whopping 20% rely on food stamps. Despite the fact that more children are using nutritional benefits now than before the recession, Congress last year voted to cut billions of dollars from the program. Meanwhile, per-pupil funding for public schools has also dropped for the second year in a row. The drop is the result of federal funding running out, as well as some states deliberately cutting funds. Wisconsin, in particular, has cut hundreds of billions of dollars from public education. And just this week, the Wisconsin legislature considered a bill that would force public schools that they deem are failures to transform into charter schools. Public education advocates slammed lawmakers for ignoring the larger socioeconomic factors that children struggle with. Rahul, does the standard political playbook include starting a program that benefits the vulnerable and then using that program's predictable failure as an excuse to cut it more or even end it? I mean, these are our country's children we're talking about.
Yeah, so there are two things going on. One is, as you say, a sort of long-term, ideologically driven plan to say, basically, if there's something that we don't like or that embodies a philosophy we don't like, let's try to destroy it instead of seeing how to balance different evils against each other, and perhaps we'll let alone elementary school kids while we pursue other ends. And the other is the fact that if public schools in Wisconsin get changed over to charter schools, they're failing largely because of the cuts in funding. That'll essentially be a way to drive a tremendous amount of state-guaranteed profit into a small number of private hands. A taste, by the way, of what the whole country can expect if Scott Walker runs for president and gets elected.
And finally, in a case that symbolizes much that is wrong about the U.S. criminal justice system, a Florida woman named Marissa Alexander was finally released from prison yesterday She had served 3 years of a 20-year sentence for firing a warning shot at her abusive husband when her case was reconsidered. Even though no one was killed, Alexandra faced the full brunt of the law. Her attorneys were unsuccessful in using Florida's controversial stand your ground laws to legally justify firing a gun in self-defense, even though this seemed a textbook case. Although she is free to go home, Alexandra remains under constant electronic surveillance and her movements are severely restricted. Advocates say that the fact that she is a woman, an African American, and a victim of domestic violence all contributed to a miscarriage of justice. Rahul, is that a proper term, you think, to see what's happened to her as a miscarriage of justice?
I mean, it's even more than a mere miscarriage, and it's a good thing that there was so much outrage over the initial verdict that it was reconsidered. One can easily imagine Marissa Alexander languishing for 20 years in prison for a crime that really shouldn't even have been a crime. And I think it's important. I mean, there's obviously a tremendous and welcome new influx of attention to the plight of African Americans in the criminal justice system and at the hands of the police. But even now, black women tend to remain sort of invisible in this, and their story is actually an important part of this. So although it is true that police killings of black males are at a greater rate than of any other group, black women get killed also at disproportionately, certainly compared to white women. Black women get much more severe sentences than white women for similar crimes, and that story is not yet really being told.
Rahul, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Rahul Mahajan sitting in for Chinjarai Kumenyika. He's a sociologist and news analyst and author of Full Spectrum Dominance, U.S. Power in Iraq and Beyond. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. You can now watch Uprising on Free Speech TV, which airs on Dish Network, Channel 9415, DirecTV Channel 348, and on hundreds of part-time cable affiliates and on Roku. President Obama cut short his 3-day trip to India this week to pay his respects to the family of the late King Abdullah in Saudi Arabia and to congratulate the new king, Abdullah's brother, Salman bin Abdulaziz Al Saud. An entourage of several officials, including First Lady Michelle Obama, accompanied the president. Among them was also National Security Advisor Susan Rice, who tweeted in #Saudi Arabia to pay condolences and honor the memory of King Abdullah, a close and valued friend of the United States. While news reports exploded at Michelle Obama's decision to forego a headscarf and shake the hand of King Salman, few have commented on the much more important issue at hand. Saudi Arabia's appalling human rights record that rivals that of the Taliban and ISIS, and the U.S.'s deafening silence on that record. The U.S. routinely criticizes states with human rights violations despite its own abhorrent treatment of prisoners and journalists, and that of its friends such as the Israelis and Saudis. My guest is Noman Ansari, a freelance writer and regular contributor to the Express Tribune magazine and newspaper in Pakistan. He is of Pakistani origin but spent many years living in Saudi Arabia. His latest article is entitled, "In Saudi Arabia, Oil Will Always Be Thicker Than Blood." Welcome to Uprising, Noman.
Hello.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, one of the stories, horrific stories emanating from Saudi Arabia that hasn't gotten as much attention in the West was a recent beheading of a woman from Myanmar, Leila bint Abdul Muttalib Basim. She was found guilty of torturing and killing her 6-year-old stepdaughter. She was executed by sword. There was even a gruesome video of her being killed that was posted to YouTube but then taken down. How typical is such a story in Saudi Arabia?
Well, I mean, there are hundreds of executions like this every year, but the world got to see this one because someone, I believe it was a policeman, who recorded the video, and they later uploaded it online. So that's why the world got to see it. Otherwise, people don't get to see it. And by the way, that guy is in trouble for recording the video and then uploading it online.
So she was executed by sword. I mean, this looks or sounds, I should say, similar to what ISIS has done on video, where they're literally slitting people's throats with knives. There's no painkillers necessarily involved. It's not the electric chair. Not that, killing somebody in a humane way is necessarily less barbaric, but still.
I mean, I'm against capital punishment, but I guess beheading is probably more humane than, say, lethal injection or the electric chair. So, I mean, if you are for capital punishment, I don't think the problem is beheading. I think the problem is the fact that the trials these people are getting are just probably not fair. So that's the issue with ISIS. I don't think the outrage with ISIS is that they're beheading people. I mean, it sounds horrible, but if you look at some of these facts, lethal injections are probably more painful and have been botched quite a few more times than beheadings. So that's not the issue, I feel. I feel the issue is that these people are not getting fair trials.
Right. So, what is the criminal justice system in Saudi Arabia? And I should mention that maybe many of our audience is not aware of this. About 30%, actually more than 30% of the Saudi population is actually immigrant. I mean, that's huge. One in every three people living in Saudi Arabia is a foreign national. And I understand that more than 50%, or around 50% of all executions are of foreign nationals. Does that statistic surprise you?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't surprise me at all. But at the time I spent living there, I found that the justice system was in favor of the locals, and the locals could get away with quite a few things. And it was often that you would find that that people who were working lower class jobs like laborers or maids, they'd be in trouble for crimes they didn't commit.
And so let's talk about this huge population of nannies and housemaids that work in Saudi households, many from South Asian countries, also East Asian countries like the Philippines. One estimate is that 1.5 million such women are living in Saudi Arabia. How common are abuses against these women, often by their own employers? Are
I'm
you with
sorry,
us?
your voice is breaking up. Could you please? I apologize.
All right, we're hearing a little bit of music in the background that's coming through. Okay, so let's try again. The population of maids and nannies in Saudi households is very large. One estimate is 1.5 million. How common are the abuses against these women, often by their own employers? Can you hear me, Noman? Okay, we're going to call Noman right back. Noman Ansari joining us live from Pakistan. He lived for many years in Saudi Arabia. He is now writing for the Express Tribune magazine and newspaper. And are you back with us, Noman?
Yep,
Okay.
I am back with you guys.
Let's try that one more time about the population of immigrant women who work in positions of, as nannies and maids and the abuses they face.
Yep, I believe it's at I believe it's a high percentage. You have these so-called people from these so-called third world countries. They're seeking a better life, so they often find these agencies which find them employment. I do remember that I would speak to some of them. I would speak to some of these guys who would come there, and they would complain that they would live in terrible conditions. You would have like 16 or 20 people, 20 young men or 20 young women living in one small housing, and no air conditioning, and you can imagine it's a desert. So there was that, and then if they aren't doing really well, or if they because their passports are held, so they're stuck.
Right.
So sometimes they're not getting paid on time. They're facing abuse.
What about sexual abuse and assault against young women, but also even young boys?
Yep, it was a common problem there. You would hear about it a lot. The freedom of press is not really something that exists over there. So there'd be a lot of rumors, but it's very common to live there and then come across someone who was stalked, or something was attempted with them. So you just kept to yourself. You kept to your communities, and
Yeah. Well, so Saudi nationals, you alluded earlier, had more rights, have more rights than foreign nationals and immigrants, and yet Saudis themselves face harsh justice under the kingdom's laws. Of course, we've heard the case of Raif Badawi, the Saudi blogger who was sentenced to 1,000 lashes. This, of course, happened right after the attacks on Charlie Hebdo. We haven't heard anything about that from the U.S. leadership. Even women in Saudi Arabia, the local Arab women, aren't allowed to drive. They're not allowed to vote. So even Saudis themselves face very harsh conditions, don't they?
Well, I believe two women have been held in house arrest, or they've been in jail for about 2 months now, because they tried to drive, and they posted pictures of themselves driving. They posted videos of themselves driving, and they've been in jail for a while. You also have Saudi princesses who've been under house arrest for what, 10 years now? So, as long as you don't, if you're a Saudi, and you're trying to, break some of their laws, which are very harsh, then you're in trouble.
And so, how much can the Saudi press report on these human rights violations? Do journalists operate under sort of a code of silence for fear of reprisal? Or are there journalists speaking out like Raif Badawi? Are there more than just him speaking out and then imprisoned or flogged?
Well, whenever I was there and I would pick up the newspaper, it would be like reading about the kingdom of well, I can't think of something, but it would be like reading a fairy tale. It would be like everything is perfect in the Saudi kingdom, and that would obviously be because the press is under, like, I don't know, they're under some harsh orders. So, you do have these bloggers and stuff who do come out and say something, but then they are in prison. Um, People who are overseas, like Saudis overseas, they are more likely to voice their concerns.
Now, when President Obama was visiting India right before he cut his trip short, he had a strong message for the Indian government, essentially saying that India should empower and educate its daughters just as much as its sons. He spoke at length about the importance of women's success to the success of a country. Strangely, when he came to Saudi Arabia, where such a message could be certainly needed, he had a total silence on it. What is your comment on Western hypocrisy with a country like Saudi Arabia?
Well, I mean, isn't it a compliment to India that he could say something like that there, without fearing some sort of a backlash? So I guess it's a compliment for India that he could say that there, even if some of them were offended by this, even if they found that a bit offensive. At least, he is able to say that there without offending, like without causing a national incident.
But why should
On the other,
President yes, go ahead, continue.
on the other hand, if he goes to Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia is an important partner of the United States in the Middle East because of what's going on with Israel and all the tensions surrounding Israel. So Saudi Arabia creates some sort of stability for the United States and the Western powers. So, yeah, they don't speak out as much. In fact, they don't speak out at all.
So, how is the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia viewed from a country like Pakistan when, on the one hand, you see the strong denunciations of the Taliban, of ISIS, and then a close embrace of their ideological brethren in Saudi Arabia?
Well, I mean, the United States isn't very trusted in Pakistan anyway. So, I mean, there's not much I can say about that. Pakistan and United States have always had a bit of a frosty relationship. It's always been up and down. So, and Pakistan considers, most Pakistanis, I'd say, consider Saudi Arabia a partner, especially with the current government, which is closely aligned with Saudi Arabia. So, I mean, I don't think there's much of a backlash there.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Noman Ansari, for joining us today, and we will post a link to your article from our website, uprisingwithsonali.com, later today. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Noman Ansari is a freelance writer and a regular contributor to the Express Tribune magazine and newspaper in Pakistan. His latest article is entitled, "In Saudi Arabia, Oil Will Always Be Thicker Than Blood." This is Uprising. When we come back, we'll examine the first day of Senate confirmation hearings that took place yesterday of Loretta Lynch as Attorney General of the United States. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. You can now watch Uprising online at our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Uprising with Sonali. Please do subscribe. President Obama's nominee for Attorney General, Loretta Lynch, faced the first day of Senate confirmation hearings yesterday. If she is confirmed, Lynch will replace Eric Holder, who announced his resignation last year, and she will become the first African-American woman to be U.S. Attorney General. Senators yesterday questioned Lynch about a variety of issues, including marijuana legalization, immigration, and the Fast and Furious program, which Holder had come under fire for. Lynch is a career prosecutor in New York whose most high-profile case involved the police abuse of Abner Louima, a Haitian immigrant in New York in 1997. While she has spoken out about police accountability, she is pro-death penalty. My guest is Michele Goodwin. She's a professor of law and chancellor's chair at the University of California, Irvine, and founding director of the Center for Biotechnology and Global Health Policy. She's also the founder of the Institute for Global Child Advocacy and president of the U.S. chapter of Defense for Children International. Welcome to Uprising, Michele.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, what do you make of the confirmation hearing so far? She gave her opening remarks where she made a very strong defense of the DOJ's pursuit of terrorism cases and talked about having a good and important relationship with the police. But what about the questions coming? Senator Lindsey Graham had questioned her about polygamy, of all things. Senator Grassley asked her about the Fast and Furious program, which she was not even remotely involved in.
Yes, no, this is very true. So this is a process where the Republicans are flexing their muscles. This is a process where Eric Holder has become a punching bag, and it's been very important for Loretta Lynch to distinguish herself and distance herself from Eric Holder, which significantly is what happened yesterday and continuing today. And so many of the questions that were directed at her really had nothing to do with her history as a prosecutor. She happens to take a conservative stance on some issues, which would be right in line with Republican thinking, such as supporting the death penalty. So it was really an opportunity, I think, for the Republicans to air their grievances against President Obama and Eric Holder.
So in a way, the whole confirmation hearing became about that. And at one point, she was asked if she was going to be another Eric Holder, at which point she said, "I will be a Loretta Lynch." Did you think she stood up fairly well to that scrutiny and to these questions?
Well, she did. So if you check from the Wall Street Journal to the Washington Post, the New York Times, many pundits say that she did an incredible job. In fact, even people who are online commenting about watching her found her to be very graceful, very sophisticated. She holds her own. And of course, she's had to be a tough prosecutor. And what I mean by tough there is a woman who holds her own. Look, she's an African-American woman breaking into this profession at a time in which, granted, there's an increasing number of women, but still having to pioneer significantly. So she did an excellent job. I think many people would agree yesterday. It's not to say that she didn't frustrate some Republicans. For example, Cornyn, he said he was very disappointed with her. Senator Cruz, I mean, that was just a ridiculous kind of hypotheticals that he was throwing at her yesterday, but she handled them with incredible grace and aplomb.
And what are some of the crazy questions that came at her from Republicans aside from the one about polygamy?
Well, it was very interesting to watch Senator Cruz and his interrogation of Loretta Lynch. He posed these hypotheticals that were incredibly broad. For example, bringing to mind Nixon. What would she have done? Would she have supported the attorney general who was at that time in office? What could have been done? And she said, well, those issues are long past and reconciled. I'm not exactly sure what you're getting at. And then he asked very broad, open-ended hypotheticals about, well, what circumstances would it be where you would not support the president? And she asked for a more specific type of question. And his response was to say, well, I can see right now that you're a person who would just simply side with the president. You're a person who wouldn't come out against the president on matters of immigration. You're not a person who would call the president on the carpet for any number of reasons. And I thought that she handled those questions quite well because they, in fact, were very vague, broad hypotheticals. And what she kept reminding the panel was that, especially when Ted Cruz was asking the questions, was that, look, my job will be to provide sound counsel based on research, based on legislation, based on policy, et cetera, which was the smart thing for a lawyer to do. Of course, it would be irresponsible for any lawyer advising the president, any agencies, to just go off the top of her head willy-nilly. And it would be irresponsible and incredibly unprofessional. And so I think that she made that point very well.
So, Michele Goodwin, are you concerned that there is still, despite some of these questions thrown at her and some of the hostility from Republicans, are you concerned that there is actually enough of a level of support from Republicans that she's likely to be confirmed? But should that give progressives pause? Because what about her policy positions, such as on the death penalty, should concern us?
This is an excellent question. It is an excellent question. For example, it will take only 3 Republican senators in this process to push her forward, given the support that will come from Democrats in this process. That said, progressives are deeply concerned because she's a person who is pro-death penalty. She finds it to be an efficient way to handle significant crimes such as that for which the death penalty would be appropriate. She has distinguished herself from Eric Holder, who has been suggested to be the most liberal of anybody, progressive of anybody who's serving in Obama's cabinet right now. I think it's an open case. We don't know necessarily what her views on gay marriage will be. Of course, Eric Holder has been a person who's not enforced, didn't enforce DOMA. At the same time, there are other concerns that progressives may have with regard to her stance, such as with marijuana. She said that she disagrees with President Obama and his assessment about marijuana.
So if she is confirmed as Attorney General, could we see some of the few moderate and modest steps and proposals taken by Eric Holder being undone, such as things like mandatory minimum sentencing at the federal level that he's worked to undo?
Possibly not. So one issue that she has been concerned about has been the way in which we police in this country.
Right.
And I think at this point, there is broad consensus that the drug war was a failure, that it has cost governments. There are Republicans, in fact, who are leading this charge. In fact, the one area where Republicans would probably agree with Eric Holder was just the extreme cost financial, and I think they'd recognize also in lives, that were spent with the drug war. These mass incarcerations, we incarcerate more people in this country than anywhere else, and that's just not men, it's women too. So on that point, I think that she would probably be consistent with Eric Holder. And likely, with Obama having just 2 more years in office, we probably won't see rollback on the kinds of policies that Eric Holder supported. I think that the Republicans wanted to bat her around yesterday significantly because they're just teed off at Eric Holder.
Right. So let's stay on this issue of the criminal justice system and police violence. Of course, in the past 9 months or so, the issue that has been long simmering under the surface has exploded into the mainstream national consciousness with the killing of Mike Brown in Ferguson. And it was just a few days ago, in fact, that the Justice Department decided, the federal investigators decided that they would not charge Officer Darren Wilson upon the completion of their study into this incident. How seriously has Holder taken an issue that is clearly a huge problem in the U.S.? And how seriously do you think Loretta Lynch would take it, given her position, for example, the position that she played in the Abner Louima case? Now, granted, that was in 1997.
Yes. Well, these are urgent concerns. And with Eric Holder, I don't think that we can necessarily attribute the fact that there aren't charges pending by the federal government, the Justice Department's investigation. I don't think that we can say because of that Eric Holder has not been committed to these issues. In fact, I think that he's been far more vocal than anyone else out of the White House actually on these issues, and that's probably including the president as well. But I think that the issue that you raise is incredibly important. And what's a big disappointment here is that we've never made this a national issue, and that is this intersection of policing, class, and race in the United States. Take, for example, czars. We tend to appoint czars, or presidents do, because we say there is an important national issue that should be addressed. Now, there have been czars about cars, bioethics, even Ebola. We've never had one on race. We've never had one on policing. Now, to think about how this country has been so deeply embedded in racial turmoil, almost since its beginning, it's a bit ironic and strange that we've never at the federal level said we need to really investigate in this country how we think about race and how we police along the lines of race. Now, this is a time for an opportunity to expand our thinking about that. And that expansion can come not just from at the top, but there's incredible authority through the lower ranks that could, in fact, be energized by Loretta Lynch. This would be an enormous opportunity, and I would hope, given her history on these issues, that she would think about that and could even move the president into some more formal action about this, and not just, committees that address Black boys and the fact that Black boys should be more respectful, but actually something far more substantive about this, which is really a tumor that's been festering in our country.
Right. Well, Eric Holder had, as you have said, been quite verbally outspoken on many issues, including the prison industrial complex and the school to prison pipeline. He actually named it that. He used a term that activists have been using for years, the fact that children from a very young age, through disciplinary procedures, and I know this is your area of expertise, so you really know this, are disciplined and set up for a life in and out of prison. Has Eric Holder done anything beyond studies on this issue? And are you hopeful Loretta Lynch could move forward on really addressing this in a real way?
I certainly am hopeful. In fact, right now I'm tuning in from Geneva, Switzerland as a delegate, a U.S. delegate to the World Congress on Juvenile Justice. So these are issues that are very important to me, both as an academic matter and also as a matter of human rights and activism. And I think that Eric Holder really gained so much support from progressive corners because, in fact, he did, in fact, use the same type of verbiage that had been used in activist corners for quite some time. And yes, Eric Holder in 2013, during the summer of the National American Bar Association meeting, he met with lawyers from all across the country, and he said this drug war is a failure. It was a powerful speech. There hadn't been anybody else from a White House in any memory since Reagan and his push for a drug war that had ever come before the American Bar Association, the lawyers, the judges, the policymakers, and said, look, this is flawed. It has racial impacts that we should be concerned about. It has class impacts that we should be concerned about. I was disappointed that he didn't raise issues with regard to gender and sex, which are very huge. Now, Loretta Lynch, again, this is a perfect opportunity for her to step into this. And I think Republicans, interestingly enough, now see this as an urgent issue because they're finding their state budgets, in fact, to be in such jeopardy because they've spent so much effort on incarceration. In California, there's 6 times as much money that's spent on incarcerating youth than putting them through college. It's just absolutely absurd. And we cannot sustain these systems at all. We really cannot.
Well, speaking of the issue of juvenile justice, a story has recently been making the rounds of social media that I want to take the opportunity to bring up with you. A little-known story of a young man in Georgia who has been incarcerated for 18 years, starting at the unbelievable age of 13. He was convicted on murder charges. Michael Lewis, who is, surprise, surprise, African-American, literally grew up in prison. It's a horrible story, and I'm wondering if you think there's any hope that somebody like Lynch would push for retroactive justice for someone like Michael Lewis.
This is a great question. Now, I doubt that she'll get deep into the woods on a question such as his case. But that said, there are opportunities for the Justice Department to be far more responsive. One point that I want to make, a couple points. One is that we have more jails in this country than we do have colleges. That's really important to note. And the second thing is that actually there is an opportunity for the Justice Department to be far more engaged on the intersection of civil rights, human rights, and incarceration in many different ways. For example, it was during the Bush administration, actually, that a bill euphemistically called the Emmett Till Act came into being. Now, it's a different take on this, which is to say that the law was really about bringing justice for families whose loved ones had been murdered in the 1950s and the 1960s so that there could be reinvestigation. That perhaps opens up Ferguson types of cases. The only problem is that it's not well funded at all. So where's the money to go about doing these investigations? This said, my goodness, we know that last year there were more than a handful of people who were on death row who were exonerated because they had not committed the crimes in which they were accused. They were African American. So these are very significant issues. And as a justice matter, we really ought to think about what type of country are we that would choose to incarcerate for life children who are too young to vote, too young to drive, too young to do so many things that we would say they don't have the capacity to do, and yet we would say that they have the capacity to be charged as adults in so many types of crimes where in fact they may feel coerced, may be in fact coerced to providing confessions. And so these are deeply concerning issues, in addition to the fact that so many young people are not even having trials anymore because they're being pushed into plea deals where prosecutors leverage the threat of many, many years in prison, but that could be spared if only they would take a plea for 10 years, for 15 years. This is not consistent with what our Constitution is founded upon, and we really need from the highest levels of government and the Justice Department to consider these issues.
Well, we wish that you could have a one-on-one with Loretta Lynch and bring out all of these amazing and very important issues. Michele, I want to also talk a little bit about another very important issue that Attorney General of the United States has to deal with, and that is the issue of terrorism cases. Now, Loretta Lynch was asked about that. She has proudly declared that she has prosecuted a number of terrorism cases in New York. We know that there's a large problem in this country with with the racial profiling of Muslims in particular. Yet, when asked whether she thought waterboarding was torture, she was very clear and unequivocal and said, yes, waterboarding is torture and therefore illegal. Where does she stand in comparison to Eric Holder, and also in terms of the standards that progressives would like to see on the pursuing of terrorism cases and the racial profiling of Muslims and the treatment of prisoners, terrorism convicts?
Sadly, some of this will be wait and see.
Yeah.
So here's the challenge with these hearings, these confirmation hearings, is that we sometimes find out that who these individuals happen to be during the process of being confirmed happens to be someone that's different and distinguishable from the person or officers that they happen to be after they happen to be confirmed. This has come up with Chief Justice John Roberts. He first didn't know whether or not he was a member of the Federalist Society, and since he's been a justice on the Supreme Court, it's very clear that, in fact, he leans in Federalist Society kinds of views. Now, that's just an example, regardless of what one thinks of the Federalist Society. My point being is that sometimes individuals try to get through these processes with as few pricks as possible, and then we find out afterwards where they really stand. So what we do know that is important is that Loretta Lynch does not support waterboarding. It's also important to know that she's been very sensitive about issues involving race and profiling. So that's very good to know. And then the rest, then we will really have to see.
I believe she said
as curious as you.
Yeah, I believe she said, unfortunately, that she does believe in using military commissions rather than civilian trials in some cases. So we'll certainly see. Finally, Michele Goodwin, of course, we want to judge people by their background, their experience, what we think their policies are. But there is certainly a symbolic issue at heart here, which is that so many years after the founding of this country, after the ending of slavery, after the ending of Jim Crow racism, how important is it for us to confirm an African-American woman for the first time as Attorney General? Loretta Lynch's sorority was present to support her. Her family was there. She cited her own family background and the service that her father and her mother have given. I think even she realizes that it is an important symbol.
Well, here's what's interesting. So what does her confirmation mean in light of the Bush administration, which many people dismiss as for its diversity, although there was Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell, Gonzalez, et cetera. Now, why do I raise that? Because perhaps in the wake of seeing that level of diversity at the highest levels within the Bush administration, that maybe we sort of ignore those same kinds of diversity issues that come out in the Obama administration. But let's face it, in our federal government, in our Congress, we have only 20% of women who are represented there. So this is quite significant. We do not have a representative democracy in that way. And background really does matter. There are many who argue against that and say, well, content of character and not necessarily gender, sex, or race. But let's think about this. If you could think about during the Jim Crow period, the number of lynchings and murder and brutality, the burning down of churches, the burning down of homes, so much of that here in the United States. And there were many people that thought that that was just simply normal. So the point being, if you have a sensitivity about those communities, doesn't mean that you necessarily come from those communities, but you recognize the humanity in others because you're empathetic and open to that, then that means that probably you're better suited to carry out a justice mission, if you will, for the country. So in that way, I think that she comes from a background where she would be actually a bit perhaps more attuned or sensitive to those who have the least. And I think, in fact, our justice system needs exactly that. It's not necessarily the majorities whose rights we have to be concerned about, although let me be clear, we should be concerned about the constitutional rights of everybody. But the interesting thing about majorities is that there are many ways in which they're able to exercise their liberty and access to the democratic process. It's really those who happen to be far more vulnerable and marginal who really need the support of our justice system. And so in that way, perhaps she will bring to this job a level of sensitivity and background that we have not seen in some other administrations.
Well, let's certainly hope so. Michele Goodwin, such a pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure.
Michele Goodwin is a professor of law and chancellor's chair at the University of California, Irvine. She's also the founding director of the Center for Biotechnology and Global Health Policy, joining us live from Geneva, where she is at a conference. This is Uprising. When we come back, we'll examine a fracking victory in Carson, California. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. A massive drilling project in the town of Carson has been dropped, much to the joy of activists who pressured for years against it. Occidental Petroleum, which was recently renamed California Resources Corp., had a plan to drill 200 new wells in the Southern California city, possibly using hydraulic fracturing or fracking to squeeze oil out of the area. Some of the wells would have been 2 miles deep. Last year, Carson city officials placed a moratorium on drilling, but then reversed that ban. Now it appears as though the company itself is pulling back and has asked the city to withdraw its application to drill. In a statement released on Monday, California Resources said it, quote, is no longer practical in the current commodity price environment. Joining me on the phone today is Alexandra Nagy, an organizer with Food and Water Watch, which has been very involved in the fight. Welcome to Uprising, Alexandra.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, what was the plan originally? Were the wells supposed to be traditional oil wells or fracking operations? Either way, how serious a problem would it have been to the local community in Carson?
Originally, Occidental told the residents that they would use fracking as the technique of choice in these 200 wells. And right then and there, the Carson residents decided that no, they don't want this, and they were going to fight this project to the very end. And that's what they've done. And regardless whether it had been fracking or just regular oil and gas wells, these are major polluters in communities that cause air pollution. There's concerns about it causing water pollution, and it's just not viable for healthy communities. And the Carson residents knew that and fought against this project.
Now, it's not that there's no wells currently in Carson, right? I mean, there are existing oil wells or older operations?
Yeah, the Domingos oil field, which is where the Oxy project was slated to go, is a very old field. It's been around and been in production since the turn of the 20th century. But it's for the most part gone idle and is not active anymore, largely because technologies needed to make that field productive, like fracking, have only come around recently. And Occidental was really the first company that tried to go back and re-stimulate this old field. And so the wells that are there have been abandoned and are scattered throughout, but it's not a huge productive field anymore.
Why did California Resources, aka Occidental Petroleum, withdraw its application? Do you believe that low oil prices forced it to abandon the project?
Absolutely. I mean, that was the push over the edge, but if the community hadn't been fighting since 2012 to resist this project, they would be drilling there now. It would be Occidental, and it would be Occidental drilling there now. When we saw over the course of the fight, when we had the residents push to get a moratorium introduced, we saw Oxy stock fall 4%. And so we know that when communities stand up and fight back, they do lose, the energy companies, they lose money. And it's not, over time, it costs money. And so with the market being the way it is, it was just sort of the final push over the edge. But we know that moving forward with the zoning ordinance that we're working to put in place, we're going to make sure that they can't come back.
And I want to get to that in just a minute, but the state of New York recently won a statewide ban on fracking. The city of Denton, Texas, considered the fracking capital of the nation, also won a ban at the ballot, although oil companies are threatening, and even regulators at the city and state level are threatening to avoid that. But still, major victories. Carson, California seems to be joining this growing list of localities where citizens are rising up. What sort of model of organizing did people use here in Carson? Is there a playbook that activists around the rest of the country where fracking operations are happening can use?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the model of organizing, first and foremost, is that you have to make this fight personal, and that's what Carson residents did, knowing that you can't trust the government and you can't really trust the agencies to have your best interest in mind. We've seen Carson City Council sort of flip-flop. We've only seen a couple of few champions on the City Council there with Lula Davis Holmes and Albert Robles. And so really identifying who's going to be with you and what you can accomplish is what they did. And they noticed that, in order to do this, we have to get our lawyers, we have to go knocking on doors, we have to figure out what's the best for us, because there are people on our council that don't agree with us. And so what we've been doing, in addition to getting moratoriums, in addition to fighting Oxy's fake bans, and they tried to push through a fake ban that was essentially a ban with a loophole in it, just saying anyone could go and get a permit to frack from the city engineer. We've been working on getting this ordinance passed, which we have been seeing in New York, which we have been seeing in Texas and other places in California, really changing the zoning code. That is the best right. That is the best way for cities to exercise their power over the oil and gas industry. And the citizens can influence that by working with their city council, the ones that agree with them, and then working to organize the community to push that agenda forward. And that's exactly what we've been doing. So it is all about talking to each other, about making it personal, and analyzing where you are and what you can be doing to fight back against oil companies, and zoning ordinances have been very, very successful in that.
And just yesterday, the news broke that Scotland has announced a moratorium on fracking for shale gas. Of course, another country outside the United States, but a huge victory for those people who are trying to fight against this particular form of fossil fuel extraction. Do you see a sort of domino effect around the country and also around the world on this?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, definitely we're seeing victories across the world. And here in California, what we're doing is we're working to get 10,000 people across the state to build on that momentum we've been building in Carson and Beverly Hills, Santa Cruz, to put pressure on Governor Brown to enact an immediate moratorium on fracking. We've seen New York do it. Now we've seen Scotland do it. It's really time for Governor Brown to step up and say, yes, I want to be a climate leader that agrees that people shouldn't be living next door to fracking. And so we are mobilizing February 7th to bring our communities to Oakland, to his home, to make it personal. Climate change is personal, and so we will be doing that, hoping to bring our momentum forward to the statewide level.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the fact that it's personal, because, of course, for the people who live near these fields, it impacts their own personal health, the health of their children, and one wonders what the reaction would be if lawmakers and even the corporate heads of these companies had to live right next to one of their wells.
Right. Well, we saw the CEO of ExxonMobil, sue the company that wanted to put just a fracking well, a water storage tank in his backyard that would be a few stories high, claiming it would devalue his property and be a nuisance. And it's just really kind of funny that he's joined our side in that sense that, yeah, we don't want this in our backyard, and it's a huge nuisance, but it's also a huge health concern. And it's more than just water tank storages. It's the wells, it's the chemicals, it's the trucks, it's the workers in the hazmat suits that are being exposed to these dangerous chemicals as well. And we just really need to transition away from that, transition to clean energy, bring jobs up in that way, and make it personal. Like, we have to take it back. We have to take our infrastructure and energy mix back, and that's by getting people involved and getting solar programs on board. and moving forward that way.
So, Alexandra, just turning back to Carson for a minute, the zoning law that you're hoping and activists are hoping to put into place, that would, I understand, ensure that were Occidental to want to come back in the future when oil prices do go back up, which they will, that they would find not only public hostility, but actually some sort of law in place preventing them from restarting these wells?
Yeah, so the zoning law, we're not totally sure on what it looks like, but we do know what we asked for to be in it. So we're asking for fracking, acidizing, cyclic steam, these types of extreme, unconventional techniques to be zoned out of the city. We're also looking at setbacks. We're also looking at how far equipment can be away from people's homes. So if the industry does want to come back, they're going to see a whole host of regulations that are going to make it very unfeasible for them. The cost is going to be a little too prohibitive for them to want to come back, and that's exactly what they want. We don't want, in Carson, we don't want drilling next to our homes, and that was the loud and clear message that we heard over the course of this campaign. It's not that we just don't want fracking, we don't want drilling, period. And so this ordinance is going to do its best to put that forward.
And so give our listeners some more information about the February 7th action in Oakland, particularly our audience in the Bay Area, or those who might want to travel to Oakland to confront Governor Jerry Brown on February 7th.
Absolutely. We're doing buses from LA, Orange County, all across the state. You can go to marchforrealclimateleadership.org, and you can check on the transportation page and figure out how you can get there on a bus. There are carpools being organized as well from all over the place. And it's going to be really exciting, our opportunity to stand up and tell Governor Brown that he needs to be a true climate leader that doesn't let fracking happening next to people next door, because that is what makes climate change personal, and we are holding him accountable to that.
That's marchforrealclimateleadership.org. And Alexandra, I should say that there are several cities outside of Carson in California that have attempted, both at the ballot and also at the city council level, to take fracking operations to task and to bring local bans on. What should we look for next?
I would say look towards LA City Council. We've heard a report back from the city attorney saying that we are going to move forward with an update of the oil and gas code, which is exactly what's happening on in Carson right now. And so Carson gets to sort of continue to be the leader in front, and LA will look to see what they're doing and hopefully have the courage to put together the ban on all of those extreme techniques like fracking, but also setback limits and whatever else the community demands in return. And so that's the process that we will be going through in the next year. Alexandra,
I want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Alexandra Nagy is an organizer with Food and Water Watch, the event that she mentioned. February 7th in Oakland, the residence of California Governor Jerry Brown. More information at marchforrealclimateleadership.org. And this is Uprising. Bipasha Shom is our senior producer. Anna Buss is our assistant producer. Alexander Hobbs is our technical director. Christian Beck is our production assistant. Teddy Robinson and Jonathan Alexander are our audio engineers. Camilo Ramirez is our sound editor. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Uprising with Sonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com, where we post all of our interviews, excerpts of them, as well as audio from the full interviews and the entire show. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you tomorrow.